Well, welcome everybody. I'm Alan Rusbridger. I chair the Reuters Institute here in Oxford. And welcome to the Reuters Memorial Lecture. We were just sitting in the green room and wondering why it was called the Reuters Memorial Lecture, and none of us really knew. We thought it's probably in memory of Paul Reuters, who was that thing that's virtually impossible today. He was a British-born German entrepreneur. We don't allow that kind of thing any longer. But anyway, I think we should remember him tonight because he created Reuters, and Reuters fund the Reuters Institute, the Reuters Thompson Foundation. It's great to see so many people here tonight. I can't remember when I last saw an Oxford lecture hall so packed. And I guess there are two reasons for that. One is that I guess most people in the room care about journalism and think that this is something that deserves help and deserves friends. And I certainly think that. I can't remember a time of greater existential challenge to the craft and the rationale for journalism, both commercial and technological and editorial and political in many parts of the world. And the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism exists to try and think about that and allow conversations and encourage research and engage with journalists. And it does that remarkably well. And it does it in many ways, and one of the ways it does it is by bringing journalists to Oxford as a kind of haven of thinking space to give people time and the ability to collaborate and think about the problems of journalism. And this afternoon we've had a board meeting and had a really fabulous discussion both about platforms and their challenge to and responsibility for the news environment, but also about innovation in newsrooms and what journalists are doing to rise to the challenge of this crisis that we face. And I'm guessing the other reason that you're here today is because of tonight's speaker, Marty, who is, I guess, probably the most famous editor in the world. And wherever Marty goes, Hollywood goes after it. And these incredibly famous film directors can't resist him for reasons that you'll discover when he starts speaking. And first of all, he was a star of Spotlight about the time that he was at the Boston Globe. And then recently, there was a wonderful film about the Post, the paper Marty now edits. Admittedly, it was about a time 40 years before Marty actually turned up under an editor called Ben Bradley, and for many years the world wondered if there would ever be another editor who could fill Ben Bradley's big shoes. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of people think that Marty is that editor, and that he is the editor that journalism needs to show the way about what journalism can do to rise to this challenge. I must say he's had a stroke of immense good luck that some of us who were struggling to compete with Marty wouldn't have minded. Many of us sat there wishing that there was a fairy godmother who could appear, who would have unlimited amounts of cash, who, say, the richest fairy godmother in the world, who understood how technology worked, and who would promise never to interfere with the editorial content. But of course, such people don't exist, except in fairy stories, and except in the Washington Post. So Marty was incredibly lucky that a man called Jeff Bezos came and bought the Washington Post. And as far as I know, he's been a model proprietor, and we all wish we could be like Marty and have a fairy godmother like Jeff Bezos. But actually, Jeff Bezos has been incredibly lucky too, because he inherited Marty. And as I say, Marty is one of the fairest, toughest, most inspirational and wisest editors in the world today. And all those qualities are needed because of the thing that he's going to be speaking about tonight. Marty was here this time last year, and we were joking a bit about how the future of the world lay on his shoulders because we needed journalism to rise to the challenge that the American electorate has given the world. And that's what Marty's going to be speaking about tonight. Funnily enough, this afternoon in our session, Marty was incredibly optimistic. I can't promise he's going to be terrifically optimistic this evening, but anyway, we're very privileged to have him, and we will have a discussion afterwards. But Marty, please come up and give us this lecture.
Thank you, Alan. That was great. I'll let Jeff know that he's a fairy godmother. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here and have the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to the Q&A and the panel discussion that comes afterwards. So over the last few years, during the US presidential campaign and then after, during the first year of a new administration, many of us in the press came to wonder why the old rules of journalism no longer seemed to apply. How was it that when we reported that what a candidate said and then what the president said was false, much of the public shrugged it off? How was it that so many people believed things that were untrue, even though we could document that they were false? How was it that websites created overnight could successfully disseminate falsehoods and crackpot conspiracy theories, suffering no consequences for deliberate deceit, but instead gaining audience? I got what I believe to be some answers when I was directed to the late Neil Postman's 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Postman's idea was that the shift in media consumption from the printed word to the television signal had changed the very fundamentals of how we communicate, and thus had altered our culture and our politics. While the public, he felt, worried most about an authoritarian world as envisioned by George Orwell in the book 1984, he believed the future as imagined by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World was more likely. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us, he wrote. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. And Postman argued that a so-called age of exposition, when people were informed by the printed word, and its implicit requirement that arguments be rooted in logic and evidence, had been replaced by an age of show business. What did this mean? It meant that surface appearances mattered more than reasoning. It elevated performance in the sense of acting over performance in the sense of achievement. Take the issue of credibility. In the age of show business, as Postman put it, credibility, quote, does not refer to the past record of the teller for making statements that have survived the rigors of reality testing. It refers only to the impression of sincerity, authenticity, vulnerability, or attractiveness. And he added that if on television, this brand of credibility, quote, replaces reality as the decisive test of truth-telling, political leaders need not trouble themselves very much with reality, provided that their performances consistently generate a sense of verisimilitude. One may look like a liar, but be telling the truth, or even worse, look like a truth teller, but in fact be lying. And Postman wrote the following in 1985. The reporters who cover the White House are ready and able to expose lies, and thus create the grounds for informed and indignant opinion. But apparently, the public declines to take an interest. I don't mean to dwell so much on Neil Postman, and I'm not predicting that Aldous Huxley's prophecy will come true, or Orwell's for that matter. But I do think that we must recognize that something profound has changed in our profession. Journalism may not work as it did in the past. Our work's anticipated impact may not materialize. The public may not process information as it did previously. The President of the United States may well be onto something when he emphasizes, as he routinely does, his television ratings. or when he explained, as he did in October, his behavior on Twitter by declaring, "You have to keep people interested," or when he remarked of the generals in his cabinet immediately after his swearing in on January 20th, "I see my generals. These are central casting." Or when in January this year, he conducted a 55-minute bipartisan immigration meeting with cameras rolling, later boasting that networks gave it great reviews and garnered fantastic ratings. Or the next day, when he welcomed reporters again to the cabinet room, saying, "Welcome back to the studio." There is clearly a heavy dose of the show, the performance in this administration. Donald Trump learned from his 14 years hosting The Apprentice. He may have learned more about today's media environment and today's political communication than we in the press yet fully understand. Before taking office, the New York Times wrote 2 months ago, Mr. Trump told aides to think of each presidential day as an episode in a television show in which he vanquishes rivals. And just before he took office, one of our reporters asked him how people would know if he had fulfilled his promise to make America great again. Aside from talking about jobs and infrastructure, he talked of being a great, quote, cheerleader for the country, and then previewed a spectacle he had in mind. We're going to show the people as we build up our military. We're going to display our military. That military may come marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. That military may be flying over New York City and Washington, D.C. for parades. I mean, we're going to be showing our military. Now, it now looks as if we may be getting that military parade. In fact, Trump's showmanship goes incredibly deep. In the 1980s, when his first marriage had collapsed, as one of the Washington Post's writers recently recalled, Trump not only didn't push back when tabloid newspapers turned the collapse of his first marriage into a daily soap opera, Trump actively participated in the scripting of the drama, calling gossip writers, dishing out salacious morsels almost by the hour. "The show is Trump," he said then, "and it is sold-out performances everywhere." Bret Stephens, a conservative columnist for the New York Times and previously the Wall Street Journal, authored a November piece headlined, "We are all part of Trump's show." But months earlier, in a brilliant lecture, Stephens cautioned, at some point, it becomes increasingly easy for people to mistake the reality of the performance for reality itself. I want to pause here to say that I am not expressing a view on the results of the presidential election or the president's policies. I have deep respect for our democratic system and the public's right to select whomever they prefer to lead the country. People have their own reasons for voting as they do, and it's to be expected that whoever is elected will endeavor to execute policies consistent with positions articulated during a campaign. Let people debate what's right and proper. That's our system. That is the same democracy, by the way, that gives us in the American press the constitutional right to publish freely without government interference, a right I cherish. Yet the founders of the United States created a democracy where the president is not a king. He occupies a central role, but so does Congress. The courts do too, and so does the press, which is why the founders crafted the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. That amendment places checks on government's power. Freedom of religion, one of the rights there, puts limits on the government, and so do the other First Amendment rights regarding free expression. That is freedom of speech, freedom to peaceably assemble, freedom to petition the government for a redress of grievances, and freedom of the press. Those last four rights were designed with a clear purpose: holding government to account. Or as founder James Madison put it, the right of freely examining public characters and measures. So the job of the press is to provide citizens of our democracy the information they need and deserve to know. The question I'm seeking to address here is this: how is that all working out right now? Does the public see the press as effectively filling this role? When the press does its reporting, delivers the facts that it has gathered, and seeks to hold government accountable, how is that received by the public? What does it take to establish something as fact? Do the old ways still work? And if not, how does democracy function when we can't agree on a baseline set of facts? What if the public rejects the very idea of an independent arbiter of what's true and false? The late US Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan liked to say, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. What if people believe they are not only entitled to their own opinion, but to their own facts? Where does that lead? A few sobering statistics tell us where things stand today. A Politico Morning Consult poll published in October showed that nearly half of all Americans, 46%, believe the news media fabricate news stories about Trump and his administration. 3/4 of Republican voters believe that. A Gallup Knight Foundation survey released in January found that 4 in 10 Republicans consider accurate news stories that cast a politician or political group in a negative light to always be fake news. The number is 17% for Democrats. Another, the Washington Post fact-checker staff counted more than 2,000 false or misleading claims by President Trump during his first full year in office. Again, another one, a Vanity Fair 60 Minutes poll showed that 36% of Republicans believed freedom of the press does more harm than good. And finally, a YouGov Economist poll found that 55% of Republicans believe the courts should be allowed to, quote, fine news media outlets for publishing or broadcasting stories that are biased or inaccurate. And 45% of Republicans say the courts should be able to shut down biased media organizations. Donald Trump has made a distinct contribution to the muddling of fact and fiction, and his objective is evident. Our columnist Michael Gerson, a conservative, put it this way: it is the dismissal of reason and objectivity as inherently elitist and partisan. It is the attempt to destroy or subvert any source of informed judgment other than Trump himself. And that is why it is now worth recalling what Justice Robert H. Jackson of the US Supreme Court wrote in 1945 on behalf of the First Amendment. Every person must be his own watchman for truth, because the forefathers did not trust any government to separate the true from the false for us. During the campaign, Donald Trump went beyond seeking to discredit the press. He sought to marginalize us, then to delegitimize us, then to dehumanize us, calling us disgusting, scum, the lowest form of humanity, even the lowest form of life. Only 4 weeks into his administration, he labeled us the enemy of the American people. By late summer, he questioned our patriotism, saying, "I really don't think they like our country." And by the end of the year, he was calling the news media a, quote, stain on America. His first full day in office, the president went to the CIA to declare himself at war with the media. And indeed, he has been. Statistics about Trump's tweets capture the unrelenting nature of the assault. Since he declared his candidacy in 2015, he has posted more than 1,000 tweets critical of the press. From December of 2016 to December of 2017, Trump tweeted about fake news more than 150 times. All this in the United States, which historically championed press freedom as a foundational principle that truly made America great, inspiring people around the world seeking free expression of their own. Chris Wallace of Fox News, of all places, has declared President Trump is engaged in the most direct, sustained assault on a free press in our history, adding, "I think his purpose is clear, a concerted campaign to raise doubts when we report critically about his administration that we can be trusted." The observations of Yale professor Timothy Snyder apply here. "To abandon facts is to abandon freedom," he has written. "If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power because there is no basis upon which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle." As he seeks to undermine confidence in the work of mainstream news organizations, the president himself traffics in baseless conspiracy theories. One of our political writers, James Hohmann, labeled him the most conspiracy-minded president in US history, rattling off the baseless theories he has promoted over the years. Falsely claiming that Barack Obama is from Kenya, wrongly claiming that Obama did not attend Columbia University, insisting that Obama personally bribed New York's Attorney General to investigate Trump University, suggesting there may have been foul play when Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died in his sleep, asserting that the IRS audits him because he's a Christian, standing by a false claim that he watched TV footage of thousands of Muslims celebrating in New Jersey on 9/11 after the collapse of the World Trade Center, suggesting that campaign opponent Ted Cruz's Cuban-born father was involved somehow in the Kennedy assassination. The day after Trump took the oath of office, the White House press secretary, acting on the president's instructions, excoriated the press for unfavorably comparing the size of his inauguration crowd to that for Obama. The press secretary angrily insisted, quote, "This was the largest audience to ever witness the inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe." That was false. National Park Service photographs proved it. Trump claimed that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally, alleged fraud without which he would have won the popular vote. False. No one has produced evidence of any pattern of fraud. The president declared that his predecessor had wiretapped Trump Tower before the election, but never produced evidence. Judging from sworn congressional testimony of the former FBI director and the National Security Agency chief, he never will. This can be head-spinning stuff. In February of last year, when the president spoke to a conservative group, he attacked a story of ours. The Post had disclosed that General Michael Flynn, his national security advisor at the time, had not told the truth when he insisted that he had not held pre-inauguration discussions with Russian officials about sanctions against that country. In fact, he had held such discussions, we reported. He lied to the American people. And now, based on his December plea of guilty to criminal charges, we know Flynn also lied to the FBI. For our story, we had 9 sources, and we said so. And yet the president declared, "There are no 9 people. I don't believe there was 1 or 2 people. They make up sources." That was an odd statement, because the president had just fired General Flynn, explaining that Flynn had not told the vice president the truth about his conversations with the Russians. But the president went a step further. He pointed to our story in his call for a criminal leak investigation, which raised a question. If the president really believed we had no sources for our story, then what leak did he think needed investigating? By March, even the conservative editorial writers of the Wall Street Journal were at wit's end. They published a piece entitled "A President's Credibility," pointing to what they described as the president's, quote, "seemingly endless stream of exaggerations, evidence-free accusations, implausible denials, and other falsehoods." Still, it goes on. Toward the end of the year, the president privately advanced the idea that the infamous Access Hollywood tape was a fake, That tape was a recording published by the Washington Post near the end of the presidential campaign. It documented Trump boasting about grabbing women's private parts. After it was published, Trump offered up a rare declaration of remorse. "I said it, I was wrong, and I apologize," he said. But once a year had passed, and amid widespread allegations of sexual harassment allegations against other prominent figures, the president reversed himself, asserting privately that the recording had been fabricated. At about the same time, the New York Times reported Trump was once again questioning the authenticity of President Obama's birth certificate. It did not seem to matter that Trump, finally during the campaign and under pressure to admit the truth, uttered these words: "President Barack Obama was born in the United States." This all may get worse before it gets better. Tribalism in media consumption is becoming more pronounced. The Reuters Institute's digital news report last year identified the US online media environment as the most polarized in the world, reflecting a society that itself is equally polarized. Polling for Reuters showed that 51% of those who leaned left trusted the media, compared with only 20% on the right. A recent Poynter Institute study showed the gap growing, with 74% of Democrats, including respondents who lean Democratic, expressing a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in media reporting compared to just 19% of Republicans. The widening gap is due largely to a surge in Democratic confidence in the press since Trump's election. A Pew Research poll found that early in the Trump administration, roughly 9 in 10 Democrats said news media criticism keeps readers in line, an endorsement of the watchdog role of the press. But only 4 in 10 Republicans endorsed that view. The gap between the two was the highest ever in Pew's polling on this issue since 1985. And now there are threats to use government power against us. During the campaign, Trump mused about suing the press so as to burden us with high legal costs and penalties. More recently, when the television network ABC made a serious error in its Trump coverage that briefly sent a soaring stock market down, the president, who never accepts accountability for his own falsehoods, called upon investors to sue the company for any stock market losses they suffered. Minor errors by news outlets are seized upon and weaponized with the aim of crippling or destroying those institutions. He often calls for reporters to be fired, even for honest mistakes. Overall, this president, who has made aggressive use of his constitutional right to free expression, has said that the First Amendment provides, quote, too much protection for the press. Last month, he called US libel laws a sham and a disgrace and pledged to review them, although it's unclear what he can do since they're rooted in our Constitution, in Supreme Court rulings, and state as opposed to federal law. When speaking with then FBI Director James Comey, Trump called for more leak investigations and proposed putting journalists in prison for publishing classified information. And last summer, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, announced that the Justice Department was conducting 27 leak investigations, 3 times as many as the Obama administration, which itself had launched a record number. Sessions declared, "We respect the important role that the press plays and will give them respect, but it is not unlimited. They cannot place lives at risk with impunity." All of us in the press understand about putting lives at risk. But the thing is, we haven't done anything of the sort. The statement by the Attorney General was evidently intended to please the president and incite the public against us. What officials really seem to fear is the damage that truth can inflict on their reputations. The leak investigations have been, above all, an effort to intimidate. Thankfully, I see little evidence that the press has been cowed, and in many ways, it has been reinvigorated. At the Post, we take inspiration from the principles that were articulated for our organization in 1935, and they begin as follows. The first mission of a newspaper is to tell the truth as nearly as the truth may be ascertained. Judging from digital traffic, a surge in subscriptions, and reader comments, much of the public believes we are doing just that. On the glass wall of my office, I have posted dozens of notes from readers, and let me give you a flavor of what they say. Here's one. Thank you for your work on behalf of truth in these times of tension and mistrust. Please know that American citizens rely on you to do your job with thoroughness and integrity, and we so appreciate your role in our democracy. Another one. I am counting on you and your able reporters to keep at it. I have come to believe that the free press has saved our asses time and time again. Never has it been more important than it is today. And then finally, I subscribe to the Washington Post today because facts matter. Amid an unrelenting assault from the most powerful person on earth, the answer for us is clear. Just do our job. Do it honestly, honorably, seriously, fairly, accurately, and also unflinchingly. To show by our work, as David Tribman, the editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, put it, that the truth still matters. We also must be more transparent, reveal how we go about our reporting, tell people who we are. The Washington Post's David Fahrenthold said earlier this year, beyond the age-old requirements that we be right and that we be fair and we be clear, there is a requirement that we be transparent. That means, he said, we owe the public proof of why what we do is better. If they don't know it from our name, they must see it from our work. Tensions between the press and a president are not new. A recently released movie tells a piece of that history that happens to be called The Post. The Steven Spielberg movie is about the confrontation between the press, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and President Nixon over the publication of the Pentagon Papers, the top secret history of US involvement in Vietnam between 1945 and 1967. The Pentagon Papers were leaked, and the press sought to publish them. The Nixon administration moved to block publication, threatening criminal prosecution. The case landed in the US Supreme Court, which on June 30th, 1971, ruled 6-3 in favor of the press and its right to publish. In the First Amendment, Justice Hugo Black wrote, "The Founding Fathers gave the press the protection it must have to fulfill its essential role in our democracy. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government." That opinion of Justice Hugo Black best captures the spirit that today animates the Post newsroom, and I believe other leading American news organizations. It is our soul. But we have been reminded over many months now that as journalists, we need more than a soul. We also need a spine. And I am pleased to report that we have that too. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. Well, I warned you it wasn't tremendously optimistic, but there was a very good line at the end. So
I ended on an optimistic
You ended on
note.
on a
Okay.
good line, on up to the optimistic note. Now, this is Oxford, so I'm expecting some terrifyingly intelligent and piercing questions in about 15 minutes. But while you think of them, because Oxford time is different to other time, we've got a panel of fabulously interesting people here, starting with Vivian Schiller here, who has had amazing editorial roles at the New York Times and National Public Radio and Twitter and many other places, too many to mention. We've got Steve Ensler-Bahia, the professor of political science at Harvard, who may know a thing or two about some of the things that we were hearing about from Marty. And then we've got Rita Kapoor, who is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Quintillion Media in India. Rita, why don't we start with you? Does what Marty said tonight, has that got any echoes? Are there any unpredictable statesmen in India that that we should know about?
Well, I think with Trump, I think there's a declared open war, and everybody knows where everybody stands, and I think it's a little more clear and present danger. In India, which is the world's largest democracy, we've had a prime minister who has not had a press conference since he came into power, which speaks volumes. There is communication. We hear the prime minister a lot, almost every day, but it's one-way communication. We hear him on his radio broadcasts, which are called Man Ki Baat or So My Heart Speaks, or a similar, but it's all one-way communication. And there is, you see, especially in a lot of mainstream media, you see a capitulation. It's difficult to draw connect the dots directly between the powers that be, but every night on mainstream media, there's very little reportage. There's almost no reporting. There's a lot of debate. And the debate is sort of tom-tomming nationalism, and is a quiet but clear pushing sometimes of the Hindu nationalism. And there's a constant shouting down of anybody who comes on these. They're really quite funny because there's sort of 16 windows open and everyone's trying to get a word in, but it's largely the news anchor who's just screaming and shouting and actually saying, you shut up and you keep quiet, etc. And you're anti-national to anyone who has a counter voice.
But is there optimism? I mean, are there people like Marty Barron in India who are, you say some of the press have capitulated, but is there the Washington Post or New York Times that is showing what journalism should be?
Yes, of course. And the independent voices are coming from vernacular media, from the regional media, and it's coming from digital media, which thankfully still has very little regulation. And so there has been, I don't know whether people here would be aware of a recent expose by a website called thewire.in, which is looked at two very strong stories against the president of the BJP, who is the second most powerful man in the country. One which looks at how his son's business grew by 16,000 times since the BJP came into power. Now, of course, the government's reaction to that is to, well, not the government's, but the accused's reaction is to sue the site for 1,000 crores, which is about $15 million. And interestingly, most of the mainstream media, the English media, does not pick up the story against questioning the amassing of wealth, but it does put out a strong voice on the defamation story. And that's worrisome. But there soon was a follow-up story against looking at how a judge who was presiding over a matter of an extrajudicial killing in which, again, the BJP president was in some way involved, how he suddenly died and was passed off as cardiac arrest, and then further investigation that, again, mainstream media did not pick up that story for the longest time. It took an unprecedented move by the senior-most judges in the Supreme Court to call for a press conference. It has never happened, questioning the Chief Justice of India and asking him on what basis he was allocating judges to hear some of these matters, including those that involved the powers that be. And that is when the mainstream media had no choice but to pick it up. So there are people, there's a feisty Hindi journalist, senior Hindi journalist who had a talk at Harvard recently, where he actually said that democracy in India is at risk, and he actually called it not the government of India, but the government of media, since he said that they seem to have that control. But I don't quite agree entirely, because I think there are strong voices still existing, like Marty's.
Steve, we've heard obviously a perspective from an editor. You're a political scientist. I mean, what is this doing to politics in America at the moment?
That's a very big question. Yep. One thing is a shift in the relationship between the media and the government. The old story from the 90s and the 2000s was that the media had become too close and too dependent on the government, that it was too invested in getting official sources, and so it wasn't sufficiently critical. This is a big shift. Now, because of this conflict, the media that are standing up, Washington Post, New York Times, and so forth, are very critical. I guess I have a question for Marty in this regard, which is, what is that doing to the relationship between the reporters and the government sources and the sourcing of information? That's a very important channel of information, especially for the DC press. And I could imagine this going one of two ways. It could shut down those sources, but it could also open them up, because many people in the bureaucracy in the United States are not happy with the way things are going at the higher levels of the government.
Yeah, I think it's doing both, actually. It really is. I mean, I think that there are people who are concerned about what's happening, who are opening up, and who feel that they have an obligation to let us know what's going on. And then there are other people more in the line of political appointees who want to shut us down or shut us out, or are only talking to media outlets that are in line with their point of view. So let's say Fox News or something like that. Primarily Fox News, as a matter of fact. So that, I think it's cutting both ways. At the same time, in this particular White House, it doesn't act in unison, as you may have noticed. So there's a lot of internal dissension and disagreement and fractiousness, and people have been willing to speak to us on many of our stories. We had 9 sources, we had 12 sources, we talked to 20 people, things like that, and they're telling us quite dramatic stories about what happened internally in the White House. So it does cut both ways, definitely.
But I think the hard thing is that for the media, the media can't stand on its own as a critical voice. It needs somebody else, usually in government, and having both chambers of Congress held by the Republicans means there are no ongoing, there aren't as many ongoing investigations as you would get if one chamber was held by the Democrats and one chamber was held by the Republicans.
Sure, but I don't, look, I mean, I think that we can act as, first of all, we have our editorial pages, which I'm not in charge of, that can act as an independent voice. The opinion writers can act as an independent voice. What we're trying to do in our newsroom is to actually do real reporting and actually talk to people and find out what's going on. And at times there are documents that can help us as well.
To narrow the question a bit, because that was a very broad question, but I guess part of what Marty's saying tonight is that even if he says, I've got 9 sources of this story, still people don't believe him. And you're trying to conduct a democratic government in an atmosphere in which Marty's stats revealed tonight, people just don't believe there's an agreed basis for facts, is quite a new situation.
Well, it's not that new, actually. During the Iraq War, during the lead up to the Iraq War in the early 2000s, there was a big difference over who believed the claims of weapons that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. It was highly partisan. I think part of that is a psychology where people who support the president are willing to admit to themselves false facts in order to really express support for the president. It's not really a question about the facts. It's really a question about, I'm supporting my president and I'm going to go down with it. But it becomes difficult over time for people to maintain that degree of cognitive dissonance. And we actually saw that with Trump. I think there was a big sigh of relief among the Republican electorate when he came out during the primary and said the Iraq War was a mistake. It was like, oh, thank God. Somebody's finally saying within my party the truth. So there will be that release when people can let go of some of these false claims that they're having to take on. It's a psychological problem more than anything else. But there's an audience that, because they feel they have to support the president, is saying this. The other aspect of it is that part of his core support is not people who support him for a specific policy. It's because they want things shaken up. And you still hear that in focus groups and interviews and so forth, that they're happy with Trump because he's shaking things up. He's shaking the press up, he's shaking Congress up. He's out there fighting, and they think fighting for them. So that's part of, it's like a different kind of reason for supporting somebody. It's not based on policy, it's based on a general demeanor vis-a-vis the rest of the branches of government. And in that regard, he's doing exactly what he promised.
Vivian, coming to you, I mean, I think, joking aside, one of the reasons that Hollywood quite likes Marty is that he's a sort of old-fashioned figure in a way, and he's the sort of relentless fighter for truth. He's got ink in his veins, and he's made a very good case for newspapers tonight. But he also quoted Neil Postman tonight, saying actually, what we've got is not a captive culture, but a culture of trivia. And lots of people would posit Marty on one side, and then social media and all new media on the other side, and the clickbait culture. So can you look at the other side of the story and just talk about new media and new media's responsibility for the mess we're in?
You want me to defend clickbait then, do you?
No.
Well, it is, I'm not going to defend clickbait. But the fact is, and in fact, the Reuters Institute data proves that the platforms, for it's an imperfect term, and by that I mean, honestly, largely Facebook, but also some of the other ones, are more and more a source of news all over the world, different platforms in different countries, of course. And so, yes, I am plugging the digital news report for the Reuters Institute. And so it's more and more source of news. Layered on top of that, also from the Reuters Institute data, is indication that the vast majority, particularly of young people, cannot recall the source of the piece of news they see on those platforms. They can say, most of them, the majority of them can say, I saw it on Facebook or I saw it on Twitter, but they can't tell you what source it is. And because of the great flattening effect of those platforms, where a post on Facebook looks the same, whether it is from the Washington Post or the Denver Guardian, which is a completely made-up organization that propagated this falsehood about the Pope endorsing Trump, all these things kind of look the same. So it's not that surprising that people can't tell the difference. So while I'm not blaming the platforms for some of the issues we have, between that and also the polarization where you're most likely to see posts from people that you agree with, there is no question that it has accelerated a lot of the trends we're seeing around falsehoods being spread and disseminated with anybody really sort of grasping what's happening, and this kind of polarization. So they've had a tremendous, it's been an accelerant more than anything else for a lot of the issues that we're seeing.
Ritu, I mean, Marty was talking really with sort of incredulity that this should have happened in his country, and we expected better of America with its, he quotes Madison and the First Amendment and so on and so forth. But there's a dangerous ripple effect throughout the world. And I wonder what happens in a country like India when people say, well, if Trump can get away with that behavior, so can we. I mean, can you make a causal connection yet between people thinking, well, actually, that's quite a good idea?
I think one can make the direct connection between the protectionism that is being propagated there and what is happening now in India. But I do see India as a very robust democracy still, and you can see that happening now in 2018. The beginning of 2018, we saw astonishingly the current government losing elections in a state quite dramatically, which was not expected. So what one can say with some confidence is that while there is all of this that is happening in the media and in social media, it's not everyone's buying it. At the end of the day, people still will vote for jobs and for a better life. So there is.
But do you think there's a sense in which Modi looks at Trump with his 42, 45, whatever he's got, million followers, and you talked about the one-way communication, and thinks, well, actually, that's quite a good idea. That business of just being constantly on send and not going via the press, as would have been thought virtually obligatory in the past.
So I have a feeling that Modi knows that that the people have a strong voice. There is the voice of the troll, there is the voice of the submissive media, but there is the other voice that is still, it's still prevailing. So I think he knows, or I think the government knows, that they have to eventually bow before the water. I think that hasn't changed. Now, whether they polarize, as has been, there's been an attempt to polarize, there's been an attempt, beef has become such a big issue. Release of a film called Padmavati about a fictional character. It became, for about 6 months, because it was around another state election, it became the biggest political point about saving the honor of a fictional character, with people being allowed into newsrooms with swords and threatening to chop off the actress's nose and chop off the director's head, etc. But that is happening. But I think while they might be trying to use some of the drama that they might, that they've seen succeed in the US, I think there's also an awareness that there is a line that can't be crossed. I think there is. You can see that. You can see the pushback happening.
Steve, if there was a sort of note of optimism in Marty's talk, it was, in some sense, Trump's been good for the press, hasn't he? He has reminded people what the press should be, even if not much of the press is capable of rising to it. But he's reminded people why we need the press, and Marty was talking about that shows in subscriptions and in the letters he's got pinned to his wall.
Certainly, and CNN's ratings are up, and so there's this funny relationship between the press and the government in the United States, where if there's a conflict, that's when people watch. When there's a war, when there's a scandal, that's what gets people plugged in.
I suppose I was meaning not just audiences, but about to the extent that in our most pessimistic narrative, people have forgotten why journalism is necessary. Mm-hmm. And do you feel is that too optimistic to say people are remembering why journalism is necessary?
My sense of journalists is that they're people who go into this profession because they have this passion. It never leaves them. They really don't lose that focus. But I do sense that there's been so much economic pressure on the media in the United States and elsewhere because of dwindling revenues and so forth, that there was a pervasive sense of kind of pessimism in a lot of newsrooms. And this has given a lot of journalists that I know some fight.
What's your answer to that, Vivian?
Well, I've been actually, one of the thrilling things to witness, I know you really want us to be optimistic here.
You don't have
the thrilling things to witness in the last year is sort of, it does feel like there's an emboldening of the press. And also sort of not at all loosening of standards, but a more willingness, it seems to me, to sort of call out falsehoods and call them by their name. Now, I'm not, there's a great debate about whether, when Trump says something wrong, whether you should use the word lie or not, and is that too aggressive? Can you use a synonym that doesn't feel quite as much of an attack? But whatever word you use, it does feel different in a way. And for people that are, the other benefit is for people that do believe in the media, that do rely on the media, there is more of a willingness to support media in the form of subscriptions, if you are a Washington Post or a New York Times, or membership if you're, say, a Guardian, that's UK, but also does work in the US. No, the real Guardian, and sort of a greater support and wanting to stand by journalism and stand by what's right. So that's been quite encouraging.
And when we say the American press, sparing Marty's blushes, and the New York Times, the New Yorker, how big is the field who are rising to the challenge apart from this
quite
handful?
big.
Yeah?
Oh, quite big.
Yeah,
And I
keep
would.
going.
Yeah, I'll keep going. Well, I actually, look, there's people, a lot of journalists who come from legacy news organizations look down their nose at television. But I've worked in both legacy newspapers and television. I will defend good quality television journalism. CNN is doing some extraordinary work. There are some moments that make me cringe, but they are doing some extraordinary reporting. I see some extraordinary reporting coming out of NBC from digital organizations like ProPublica, for example. Tremendous work. And on a local level, as much as local news organizations in the US are under tremendous financial pressure, it's inspiring to see a lot of the work that's coming out of local newsrooms. So the field is, Washington Post and the New York Times tend to get the most attention and arguably have reaped the benefit more of the so-called Trump bump. But there's a lot of quality journalism to go around.
Yeah. Okay, this is
And
the
the
moment,
opposite.
This is the moment where all the terrifyingly intelligent questions I get. There's a microphone. There's an arm waving at the back there. How many microphones have we got? Got two. Where's the other one? Okay. There's an arm there. So arm at the back, and can you see that arm waving there, right at the back? Yes. Let's begin with that arm. Okay. Well, he's got the microphone, so we'll start with that arm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my question is Matt Walsh, University of Northampton. My question for Marty is, to what extent does Donald Trump need you and need the US press? In the past, audiences were an important factor in getting the contact with politicians. Has that now gone? Does that no longer matter? And if it doesn't, does that mean that the future for the US press is purely oppositional?
Well, that's good. That's a good question. I think he. Obviously, his preferred outlet is, let's say, Fox News, which is a mainstream news organization, by the way, in the United States. He also turns occasionally to the Wall Street Journal, which he trusts more. It's owned by Murdoch. But they've done some really good work, particularly lately. But he also talks to the New York Times. His people talk to us. He hasn't talked to us since the election, but and I think that he does feel that he needs the press. Almost to validate him in some way, in a broader sense, so that he's not just speaking to his core base. He does govern a lot for his core base. He wants to keep them highly motivated. He would like them, presumably, to vote for him again during the next election. And many of the policies seem tailored for that particular base. But I do think that he wants to be accepted on a broader front than that. We haven't been totally expelled, and I think that he thinks it's valuable still to have us. Yeah.
I'm not going to ask everyone to answer every question, but leap in if at any point if you want to. But was there a hand at the back, or have we lost that hand? Yes. Has the microphone managed to reach the hand? Yes.
Thank you to Marty, and thank you to all of you. I used to work for the BBC for a long time, which colours my question, I suppose. But I worry about ownership, not because I'm not making any point about your fairy godmother. I have no basis on which to make such a judgment. But the principle that you and ProPublica that was mentioned rely on what I would call enlightened philanthropy. Now, however admirable is enlightened philanthropy, is it really a business model?
Well, yeah, sure. It is a business model for us. Look, we were profitable in 2016 for the first time in 10 years. We were even more profitable last year, nicely profitable, actually. Jeff's, it's not a philanthropy for him, by the way. It's not a charity, and I always tell the people on our staff, I'm glad that he doesn't treat us like a charity, because if he got tired of the charity, we would be in deep trouble. His objective is to create a sustainable business model. And I think that we're well on our way to doing that. It's hard to judge from just 2 years of profitability, but we're quite confident in where things are. So for us, it's certainly a business model. And And I don't know about others, but ProPublica seems to be doing well. It's been able to generate a lot of subscriptions, a lot of donations, I should say. And so, yeah, we're very confident. And I think it is a business model.
What happened if your fairy godmother woke up one day and discovered that she had fantastically strong political views that she wanted to have in the paper?
Yeah, well,
is there any constitutional blockage on her doing that?
Well, I hate this term fairy godmother, but godfather, yes, there you go. I'm not sure I like the term godfather either, but okay, whatever.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, if he interfered, you would know about it. I guarantee you in a newsroom of 800 people, which is what we have right now, it wouldn't take but a minute before people in our newsroom would let the world know about that, and they would object to it vigorously. You can see just how at the LA Times, when people in that staff were upset with what their owners were doing, they sort of rose up against it. And I think that would happen on our staff. There's no constitutional prohibition on it. We're a private enterprise. He can do whatever he wants. But I think people would rebel. People wouldn't stay. I wouldn't stay if that were the case. So, and I think he knows that, and I don't think he wants that. I think he understands that the core of our business model is the credibility and the independence of the institution, and he has supported that, thankfully.
There's a question there, and I've lost track where the other microphone is, but there's a question at the front here.
Thanks very much. Desmond King, I'm a professor at Oxford. Just go to Marty on this coverage, and congratulations on what the Post has done. It's an extremely important and valuable source. Is there a danger of the coverage by the media being too personality-driven and too personality-obsessed with Trump? Trump is someone who's come out of a political system. He hasn't come out of a vacuum. There's a lot of trends have developed in the last couple of decades, which Steve can say more about, but in terms of deep polarization and hatred in the American electorate between the two sides, and your statistics on the media, online media show that in particular. So that suggests to me two sorts of ways to go. One is, do we get enough coverage of the times that he breaks long-standing principles? So it's been a standard practice for candidates to reveal their tax returns. He doesn't. We discover this is a norm, not a rule, and it can be easily broken. And then secondly, are we getting enough about the long-term structural causes of Trumpism? Your staff reporter or staff colleague, Amy Goldstein, has just done this excellent book called Janesville, which is a town in Wisconsin, which happens to be the constituency basis of Paul Ryan, the speaker. That's a pretty depressing read. And it's a wholly descriptive coverage of the last 8 years in Janesville. And to me, there are lots of lessons in it. One of the most alarming is the poor education system at the high school level, from which children emerge and are supposed to be in a position to absorb information about complex political issues and to make careers, which they generally don't.
On the latter point, I think we are doing a lot of that kind of work. We actually have a team of people called the America team. Their job is to get out into the real America. When I worked at the Boston Globe for years, and there were many visitors from out of the country, and I would say, well, where are you going to get to understand America? And they would tell me they were in Boston, they had been in Washington, they were going to be in New York, and I would always say, well, when are you going to America? Because you need to go to Oklahoma and Arkansas and Ohio and all sorts of places like that, Wisconsin, many of those places. And so the purpose of our team is to constantly get out into the rest of the country and spend a lot of time there. We did a whole series over the last year called The Forgotten. And the purpose there is to continue to take the measure of what's happening in American society, to look at the broader structural issues that are influencing American politics. So we want to do that, and the more of that we can do, the better.
Question on the front here.
My name is Nicholas Tresillian, and for these purposes I'm a Brit. And I can't ask this question because I don't know enough to ask about India, but I wonder whether the panel generally might see the Trump vote and the British Brexit vote as part of the same international ripple, perhaps with some kind of underlying communal disappointment with the capitalist system?
I think that's a question for the political scientist on the panel.
I just returned from Australia and New Zealand, and there are pro and anti-Trump signs in Australia and New Zealand. So if there's any question about whether this is a global or an American phenomenon, at least in Trump's case, it certainly seems to be global, and it seems to be animated by the same sorts of insider-outsider anxieties. There's a lot of really interesting work now coming out, research on Brexit and where it came from and where the support was most intense. A lot of it seems to be generated by anxiety produced by spikes in trade, especially people in industries where there was heavy growth of Chinese importation. So if you were, I don't know what industry would be a good one to choose, but up around, think about the areas where Brexit was particularly strong in a surprising sense, and it turns out those were areas where there were industries that were heavily affected by Chinese importation. There are similar stories starting to emerge in the US about areas in the US that were affected by surges in imports from China. That suggests it is something that's truly global, which is that over the past 20 years, the world has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty, mainly in China. And that's involved a shift in income and resources out of Europe, out of the United States, and to China. And the people who bore that are people who were largely in the middle class. Middle class incomes took a big hit in these areas, and there's been a surge in voting for nationalism among those people. Now, whether we can get all the causality right is very difficult to know. But it does seem to be part of a broader ripple and a kind of human society level trade-off between rising people out of poverty in one part of the globe and the costs in another part of the globe.
I know Ritu would address that question really interestingly, but I think we'd be getting off the study of journalism, which, while we've got Marty here tonight, I'm quite keen to keep let's have somebody of a different gender from the questions so far. If we can get the microphone there, and somebody of a different gender here, we can have. Have we managed to get your microphone yet? No? Wave your hand. Yes.
Sophie Cork, I'm an undergraduate here. So one of the things that's been quite striking to me, I think, in the US political atmosphere is that it isn't just people who are from Janesville or who might be sort of perceived as less able to discern the truth who are adhering to, loyalty to party or partisanship or person rather than the truth. It's also people who are in Congress, so those people aren't sort of representing their constituents' best interests necessarily, but instead they are often either acting as a blunt instrument of their constituents' sort of kind of base beliefs and partisanship, or they are just not representing their constituents' genuine interests, and they are ignoring that in favour of party interests. So, like, there were those Paul Ryan tweets about a secretary making like $2.50 more a week, and how, wow, I'll be able to pay for my Costco membership now. And that doesn't seem to be a tax policy that is genuinely in that secretary's interests.
It's going to be slightly tough and press you for a question.
Yes. So the question now, do you think that for young people or younger people who are growing up and who are being influenced by this political atmosphere, that they will assimilate to it, and politics will now sort of be this way forever, or do you think that people are likely to react against it?
That may be a question for a political scientist again.
So, young people are still forming their attitudes. It takes, usually about 5-10 years for people's political attitudes in the United States to settle down. For example, when we see most of the change in party identification in the United States, it's usually among the 20-year-olds. So this is a time of great flux and formation of opinions. It's hard to get a beat on how the media environment is going to affect that, or the communications from Congress. What typically affects the formation of your attitudes, though, is who was elected president when you were forming those attitudes, and we see these cohorts. So people who were born in the 30s are much more democratic than people who were born in the 50s, right? And those carry throughout that cohort. So what we've seen in the last few decades is just more democratic young cohorts, but the Obama cohort was particularly democratic. I expect this cohort to be a little bit more Republican, but it depends on how this administration plays out, how the investigations play out, whether it's judged a good experience by young people or not.
Yes.
I'm Dalia. I'm a journalist from Egypt, and I'm also a journalist fellow at the Reuters Institute. And I'm very interested to know at this time of crisis that the journalism is going through in the US, how much has it brought different media outlets together or apart? Are you getting more in touch with either competition, like management and competition, to sort of decide on how to tackle the kind of pressure you're going through, or that's not something that is possible or you thought of, or like you need basically to do?
Well, I think our competitive spirits often prevail in these instances. Maybe that's not the best thing. I mean, it's not as if we don't talk about these pressures. We do talk about these pressures, and we have our own organizations where they're discussed, but it's not institutionalized in any way. It's not formalized. We do have organizations that focus on the legal defense of journalists and legal advocacy for journalists, or access to court to government documents or what have you. There is an organization called Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in the United States, which is representing us, is our primary representative before the Justice Department on what their standards would be for leak investigations as this administration reconsiders the standards that had been implemented only a few years ago in the Obama administration. And we work together on that. We go as a group, but the Reporters Committee is the primary representative there. But those are situational. They're episodic. They're not. There's no big institutional structure for that.
Rasmus.
Thanks very much. Marty, you cited from your policies and principles of the Post, the first mission of a newspaper is to find the truth or the best obtainable version of it. But also reminded us that a lot of Americans don't feel that the news media offers this. And I just wonder if you could tell us more about how you think about that at the Post and what can be done to convince those Americans that you are doing your honest best of trying to delivering on that promise. Is it more of the same, or is there something that needs to change in the way in which American journalism is practiced to convince the relatively large minority of Americans who seemed so completely alienated from the way in which professional journalism is done?
Right. Well, a little bit of context, I think, is helpful, and that is that there's been a decline in approval or confidence in many American institutions, not just the press. Certainly, we have suffered from that, but there's been, you should look at the approval ratings for Congress. Not that it's saying a great deal, but we do better than they do. The approval ratings for the president have declined sharply over the years, including the last year. The approval ratings for business, for medical institutions, for you name it, across the board, with one primary exception, and that is the military, have declined. So there's an erosion of confidence in all American institutions. And I do think that we need to do some of the things that I referred to in the speech, and that one in particular is to be more transparent about how we go about our work and who we are. People have stereotypical views about who works in media organizations, that somehow we all come from elite East Coast institutions, things like that. That's just not the case. We have people who come from all backgrounds and all areas of the country. And many who come from working class families and what have you. And I think it's important for us to tell people more about that, and then also to tell them more about how we went about our work, and also show them more of that work, more original documents, things like that. But I also like to remind people that This is a long-term proposition that during Watergate, and I'm not making a comparison, but during Watergate, the Washington Post and other news organizations that were investigating the Nixon administration were viewed very critically by a large segment of the American public. That was viewed as a partisan exercise on the part of the media. It was only when the evidence came out that the president had, in fact, committed crimes that the American public began to understand that the press had done its job and done it correctly, and the reporting was validated. Keep in mind that Nixon got reelected in the middle of the Watergate investigation. And there was actually a serious congressional inquiry into Nixon at the time. So these things change. And I think what's important is that our reporting be validated over the long term. It's not a popularity contest. I'm not worried about, obviously, I'm not happy with approval ratings, but I don't obsess about our popularity at any one particular moment or approval at any one particular moment. I take the long view on these things.
Question right at the back there.
Hi, thanks. I'm a journalist myself. I've only been a journalist for about 4 years. Currently work for the BBC, but I used to be a crime reporter at the Oxford Mill and the Oxford Times in the city, and very passionate about local news, and having sort of seen / experienced sort of the cuts which are happening in this country. Obviously they're happening in the US as well. I'd be interested to know what the panel thought on the sort of rise, sort of in my time of being a journalist, of online, which I'm working now for the BBC, but just sort of the pressures on journalists to write stories which will get clicks through, and sort of the lack of reporting. You hear some companies are telling journalists not to bother to write some stories if they don't get a certain amount of hits on them. Will that online bubble burst, and the social media bubble burst, I suppose, where you'll start getting more news reports on things that actually matter, like council meetings, which may not be the most exciting stories, but they're important for journalists to cover, to hold, especially local democracy to account.
Yeah, you get your clickbait question after all.
Yeah. I mean, one of the many consequences of the digital era is that the cost of entry to become a publisher is fallen to next to zero. So anybody with a PC can become a publisher, and there's no law against calling themselves a journalist or a news organization. You can do pretty much whatever you want. So as a result of that, and of course the rise of mobile devices and technology companies and platforms, you do have sort of a explosion. You have seen an explosion of stuff out there. Only a small fraction of it, of which anybody in their right mind would call journalism. The fact is, there is a place for entertainment. There's a place for goofy, non-dangerous stunts. There's a place for celebrity news. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but you see more of it because it does get clicked on. But the journalism, proper journalism, is in there too. And I think some of the things that have had, some of the moves that the big tech companies and platforms have made in recent years has been to recognize sort of the cheap thrills of that clickbait, and they begin to in their algorithm begin to downrank some of those things that are used to do so well, like you won't the famous you won't believe what happened next. Stories, and to look for signals of begin to look for signals of trust and quality. It's very imperfect. There's a long way to go. There's even been a little bit of backtracking lately. Story for another day. But there's a place for both. I mean, it's a big digital world out there, and people will, if people want to see quality stuff, they will.
I would just say that a lot of news organizations like ours have really shifted into a different mode, which is we're really emphasizing subscriptions, digital subscriptions. You may have noticed that we're so emphasizing that we handed out an offer to all of you. We want more. And if you didn't get one, be sure to. That is where a huge source of additional revenue is coming from now. We very much see our future based on growing digital subscriptions. The New York Times does as well. So different news organizations are going in different directions, and people don't buy a subscription in a news organization unless they have absolute confidence in that news organization. They won't do it.
Do we get the offer on the panel as well?
What's that?
Do we get the offer on the panel as well?
Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't pick one up out here. So.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Tatenda. I'm from Zimbabwe. My question is on the relationship between journalists and sources, and the power balance that exists between journalists and sources. I do agree that journalists and sources do need each other, but then my question is, who uses whom and who stands to benefit most from such a bond? Because of late we are seeing journalists getting too close to sources. Yeah.
Journalism and sources.
Well, look, we use each other, to be honest about it. I mean, there's a symbiotic relationship that takes place there. I mean, we have to be careful, obviously, if there are sources we think that are exploiting us, which is we need to do additional reporting other than just relying on one source. And we need to be more forthcoming about what the agenda of that source might be. So we need sources. They need us to get information that they have out. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I don't think it's a bad thing at all. But we have to be careful in how we manage that relationship, no question about it.
Very patient questioner there. Yes.
Thank you. Michelle Paul, Oxford Brookes and Oxford City Council. I'm a city councillor. My question is a more nuanced version, I think, of the clickbait. I read the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian and the Oxford Mail most days of most weeks. I don't think I could tell you on any given day, not having seen a paper copy, what was the front page story, because I curate the stories that appear on my feed. So I'm wondering how those kinds of behaviours are changing the roles of editors and the idea of the gatekeeping, the news values. It used to be terribly important for a reporter to get their story on the front page. Does the idea of the front page, that prominent story, still exist?
Well, it's changing. I mean, you can certainly find out for us if you're a subscriber to us because you can see our front page on our app. We have a classic app where we can actually read the paper page by page, or you can go to our homepage and you can actually see what's on the front. That said, that's not how we manage our website. It's not how we manage all of our digital assets. It's changing. Look, people want information in the moment. It's clear a homepage will change regularly. Many journalists don't measure themselves these days by whether they're even on the front page or even in the paper, for that matter. And I kind of welcome that because what they're trying to do is they're trying to achieve an audience. They're trying to get people to read them and to actually be loyal to them because they're being faithful to the facts. So you don't have to be in the paper for that. And look, most people don't read on print anymore, and that's just the way it is. And I just don't think that it's true. A lot of journalists, obviously, a lot of our reporters do care if they're on the front page. There's something tangible about that piece of paper, and they really care, and it's all validating that they've actually been selected as the lead story in the paper. But it means less today than it did in the past, and that has some consequences, I guess. But I don't know that they're all bad. Some of those choices were artificial anyway. And we only had we would only have 5 or 6 spots on the front page. The very fact that the story appeared on page 16 is because where we happened to put the national section or the foreign section or what have you, doesn't mean it was a less important story. We exercised our judgment at that particular moment as we were putting together the paper. And in many instances, the story inside turned out to be the more significant story. So,
I just want to add, there are also other proxies. There are also other digital proxies if you're looking for that kind of, that more and more are important if you're looking for that kind of curation or priorities. That incredible explosion in popularity of email newsletters from news organizations like the Washington Post and others gives you that a kind of curation. Push alerts, which have become something that many people have that have been quite successful and growing, where based on editorial judgment, the most important stories, whether it's breaking news or not, get pushed to you. So there are sort of proxies for that kind of thing in the digital space.
If I may add, another proxy is to bring the first story in the infinite scroll. So irrespective of which story the reader came in from, the next story is the most important story that would have been your front page story. So the discoverability of it is a little easier.
Another Reuters fellow here.
I'm Emma-Lena from Finland and Reuters fellow. We're almost going to my question because you've done amazing work with having digital subscribers and you have a worldwide audience, which is like another thing. Maybe you're going digital. But does your optimism go to print side, or do you print journalism on paper many years now on, or is there end glooming for the paper?
Well, I always get this question. No matter where I go, I get the same question. And I appreciate the nostalgia for print and having spent most of my career at it. I mean, look, I'll quote our fairy godmother about this, maybe. You know, these things disappear a lot more slowly than people imagine. A lot of people predicted that print wouldn't exist as of today. It's still around. It's still critically important to a lot of news organizations, but it's less important. As Jeff Bezos has said, that over time, you know, print will probably, it may still exist, but it'll be something like he said it will be like a luxury product. And as he put it, it'll be like owning a horse. That tells you where his head is at, is that eventually, over some time, and we don't know how much time, it'll probably disappear. As he also said, you know, people will walk in and they'll walk into your house and there will be a print newspaper and people will go, wow, that's amazing, what is that? We're going to get there eventually, and so I think it's really important because of just the way people consume information these days, the way they live their lives. They want it on a mobile device. They want to be able to look at it at any time. They want to know what's happening in that moment. They want information that takes advantage of all the tools that we have to see the video with the text, with the audio, with an interactive graphic. That's just the way things are. And I think that the time has come probably to accept that. Print will be around for a while. We really value our print readers. They're incredibly loyal. Fortunately, they pay good money for a print product, but eventually, you know, it probably won't be a big factor. So I don't know what the date is.
Very patient questioner there. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Ashley Riggs. I'm a visiting research fellow at University College London. 2 quick questions. You mentioned before that people who want quality news will seek it out despite all of the clickbait and all of the stuff, all of the sort of noise that's out there. But isn't there recent data out that says that the sheer volume of extreme right-wing content is actually far, far beyond other kinds of content, especially in the online sphere? And how does one counter that? That's one question. And the other is, I'm all for subscription news, but to what extent does that pre-select who the audience for that news is? Thank you.
I view ourselves as like in the early days of radio. So in the early days of radio in the United States, you could, as a broadcaster, go to any spot on the dial, right? It was the opposite, right? So like, oh, I'm not getting enough audience. I'm going to just increase my megahertz and go find some other audience. And there's just this chaos there right now that's settling itself out. And I think part of it's that. Like, I wouldn't look at numbers of stories or anything like that as the driver of what the internet's about or what even internet news is about yet. I think it's still settling out and we're still finding a business model. I think what's interesting about what happened at the Washington Post is, and at the New York Times, they seem to have found a business model, and there are big questions about whether that's going to transport to local news or other things, and just how this is all going to shake out. But it's still, I think, in an era of chaos, is my sense.
On that note, because there is drink to be had, I know that I'm terribly sorry because there are lots of people who want to ask more questions, but that's just, I think, a sign of how good Marty's speech was and how much he's provoked thought and questions. But I think drink is more important at this stage. So I want you to give me 2 rounds of applause. One is for these very distinguished panelists on my left. One is to this man here. I mean, it's incredible that. Well, hold on. It's incredible that he finds time to actually write a speech and come here and deliver it. And we're very lucky in Oxford because he's been a very loyal and diligent member of the board at Reuters. But for him to come here tonight and speak so eloquently and powerfully is a great privilege. And last year we said the world's weight was on your shoulders, and I'm afraid it still is, Marty. So go back and do it all over again.
Okay.
Thank you very much.